Okay, so today we're going to talk about the human impact and dispersal of grasses, and likely this is what led to turf grasses. So we've been talking about how grasses are dispersed and the migration events and the diversification events that occurred over the course of geologic history. Now we're going to really focus in on more recent history when humans were traveling around the world. So it's really likely, we have records from ships and ships' logs, etc., that the explorers dumped debris and material. And a lot of that debris and material was bedding and other kinds of debris from animals and that they were carrying on board. And that they dumped those wherever they found port. So these materials often were made of straw and grasses. So it's likely that a lot of those events, whether you're talking about Magellan or Descartes or Columbus, that when they traveled and moved through the world on ships, that debris and material was dumped at whatever ports they found themselves in, and that it's likely that at least some of that material found its way to shore and onto Earth and then grew and began to colonize an area. So we have that event happening, and then as the New World was discovered and settled, it's also known that those New World settlers brought with them the agrarian forages that they used in Europe for their livestock, and that was so that they could maintain animals and livestock in the New World as well for food. And so it's also quite possible that materials that were brought over from Europe were brought here to help the New World settlers establish a colony and maintain livestock similarly to the way they did in Europe. The European forage was pretty poor for turf grass when we're thinking about a turf grass. The major reason for that was that the European forages that were used for livestock development, the desire was to grow long, tall grasses that resulted in a lot of biomass because they wanted to have feed for their animals. And this was especially understood once the early mowing practices began in earnest, particularly in Europe, where those forage grasses, it became immediately apparent that they were not very suitable for something that was mowed at a shorter height of cut. So that was especially true then. But these grasses have likely naturalized in the 400 plus years that they've been here in the New World. And in order to better understand, as we talked about in previous lectures about naturalization and native grasses and so on, we need to have much more DNA-based research to better understand what grasses were naturalized and how long ago they've been naturalized. Did it happen in the 400 years or so that humans have been moving here from Europe? Or did it happen prior to that, over, say, the Bering Land Bridge, or from Laurasia or Gondwana? Any of those kinds of events could have resulted in a grass becoming naturalized here, but we need to have better phylogenetics and DNA testing to understand that, because right now we don't have a very good understanding of how that process took place. And before we start labeling things as native or not native, as we talked about in previous lectures, it's important to understand what those processes were and when they happened so that we can better understand how those events took place and what we need to call a particular plant or grass. Today, there's about 40 species out of the thousands of species of grasses that we've talked about that are used as turf grasses. In general, these grasses are cross-pollinated and they're also heterozygous. If you're not sure what heterozygous is, I encourage you to look that up on your own through Google and so on. But you'll find that cross-pollinated and heterozygous, that the result of these two things, as things get cross-pollinated and the fact that they're heterozygous, so there's dominants, recessives, and heterozygotes in between, what we find is that that leads to a huge amount of diversity. And that's really important if you want to be a plant that is easily adaptable to new environments. And that's one of the things that I think makes turf grasses so amazing and interesting, is that it's this diversity that allows them to adapt to these environments, that makes these grasses so adaptable. And frankly, probably one of the major reasons why the early settlers and us and everybody else find them to be so darn useful, is because of their adaptability. If the plants aren't able to adapt to new environments, it's really tough to establish them in places where they're not growing in their normal, quote-unquote, native condition. And so having that adaptability and that diversity allows grasses to do things that we never imagined that they could do. And so that's really a cool thing about how grasses, and in particular, in my opinion, how turf grasses have developed over time. This is ongoing. The process is still happening today. We're still adapting grasses to environments, and in fact, that process is taking place right here in Knoxville, in Tennessee, where we're at, where we are right on the border of the adaptation ranges for the warm season grasses, the C4 grasses that we've talked about, and the C3 grasses. We live in a region called the transition zone. And this is an area where neither one of those two groups of grasses, the cool season or the warm season grasses, are really well adapted. And that adaptability and that diversity of grasses is what allows us to find different kinds, both C3 and C4 grasses in our case, that are able to grow and to produce the kinds of turf grass areas that we want to have, whether that's a home lawn, a phenomenal athletic field like Neyland Stadium, or a great golf course. That any one of those things are places where grasses have to be able to adapt. The thing that's interesting about this idea of diversity and adaptability of these plants is that oftentimes critics talk about lawns and grasslands and things like that as being sterile, devoid of diversity. And it's a really unfortunate perspective, in my opinion, because these grasses are highly diverse, highly adaptable. It's amazing what a single plant that we call a grass, when you think about the 40-plus species that are turf grasses, and you think about the thousands of other species of grasses, including some of our most important crop plants like corn, rice, wheat, barley, etc., that these are highly adaptable plants capable of adapting to all kinds of different environments, all kinds of different climates. That's going to be an advantage to us, particularly as we begin to understand what happens as the climate changes. And regardless of what you believe or I believe the causes of that climate change are, it's very clear that the climate is changing constantly, and that over the course of geologic history, we've had warmer periods and cooler periods, leading to ice ages and hot, dry periods of Earth's climate. And so it's critical that our grasses be able to adapt to those environments. And that's going on right today. So that's a really interesting part of this idea of diversity. But a more interesting part, and one of the things that we're going to talk about in class, is why. Why is diversity, and the fact that our critics talk about grasses as not having diversity, why is that? What is the mindset that comes from thinking about that? Why do we think of lots of different kinds of flowers as, ooh, those are very pretty and there's lots of diversity? But if we have a lot of different grass species, that any one of those species is not as diverse. And in fact, there's a lot of, even within a single species, a huge amount of diversity, just as in there's a lot of diversity in a single species of flower. We think of the lilies. There's lots of different lilies. The orchids, tons of different orchids. And so when we think about diversity, it's really critical and important that we consider when we talk about something as being not diverse, what is the thought process? Why do folks say that? And why might they be thinking that? Because if we can understand that, then we can use those reasons to help better inform folks about the amazing diversity that we have in turf grasses.